You have probably already seen the number floating around online. 455 American soldiers dead, a base completely wiped off the map. Before you share that number one more time, you need to hear what is actually confirmed, because the real story is disturbing enough without exaggeration. Before we go any further, here's my ask. If you want the accurate picture instead of a viral rumor, hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you are tired of numbers that fall apart the moment someone checks them. And share this with the person who just forwarded you that 455 figure, because they deserve to know the truth too. Let's deal with the rumor first, honestly and directly, because pretending it does not exist helps nobody. Numbers like 455 American dead have been circulating across social media, and they are simply not supported by anything the Pentagon, independent monitoring groups, or credible reporting has confirmed. The real figures are lower, but do not mistake lower for acceptable, because what actually happened over these 13 days of continuous strikes is still one of the most intense stretches of this entire war, and it deserves to be understood accurately rather than inflated into something it is not. It is worth pausing on why numbers like this spread so easily in the first place. A war happening thousands of miles away, filtered through social media clips, screenshots, and secondhand summaries, creates the perfect conditions for exaggeration to travel faster than correction ever can. A shocking number gets shared because it feels urgent, because it confirms whatever fear or suspicion someone already carries about how bad this war has become. By the time anyone checks the actual sourcing behind that number, it has usually already been reshared thousands of times, and the correction rarely travels anywhere near as far as the original claim did. That gap between what spreads and what gets corrected is itself part of the damage this war has caused. A fog of exaggerated numbers sitting on top of an already difficult, confusing conflict. Here is what we actually know. This latest chapter began in early July, when a fragile ceasefire that had held since mid-June finally collapsed. Iran resumed strikes against shipping and against American positions across the region. The United States responded by declaring that ceasefire finished, and what followed was a stretch of 13 consecutive nights of American strikes against targets inside Iran, night after night, without a single pause. 13 days of continuous bombing, 13 nights where people on both sides of this war went to sleep, if they slept at all, not knowing whether their base, their neighborhood, or their family would still be standing by morning. Think about what 13 consecutive nights of active strikes actually means for the people living through it, on every side of this conflict. It means air defense soldiers standing at their posts every single night, not knowing which night would be the one that mattered most. It means families in Iranian cities listening for warning sirens that may or may not give them enough time to reach shelter. It means service members stationed at bases across an entire region calculating, night after night, whether their specific location might be the next one targeted. That kind of sustained tension does something to people that a single dramatic strike never fully captures. It wears down resilience slowly, night after night, in a way that eventually shows up in exhaustion, in mistakes, in decisions made under a level of accumulated stress that most people watching from a safe distance can barely imagine. During that stretch, American forces confirmed the deaths of several service members, not hundreds, but enough that each name and each hometown deserves to be spoken clearly rather than buried under an inflated statistic. Private Isabella Gonzalez, 19 years old, from Carrollton, Texas. First Lieutenant Tyler Feehan, 25, from Iwa Beach, Hawaii. Sergeant Angel Rampersad, 28, from Ozone Park, New York. All three were air defense soldiers, killed when Iran struck an air base in Jordan called Muwafaq Salti with some of its more advanced ballistic missiles. Reporting around the same period confirmed that the total number of American service members killed since this war began back in February had climbed into the high teens, with wounded figures numbering in the hundreds, not the false 555, sometimes quoted, but genuinely close to 430, according to Pentagon reporting reconciled around this same window. That is the real number. Not 455 dead, close to 430 wounded, alongside a death toll in the high teens. And if that correction makes this story feel any less serious to you, it should not, because those numbers still represent one of the costliest stretches of American military engagement anywhere in the world in recent memory. Consider what those wounded figures actually represent beyond the raw statistic. Reporting around this period described nearly 100 American troops injured across just the 2 weeks surrounding this specific stretch of fighting, layered on top of months of earlier casualties dating back to when this war first began. Blast injuries, burns from drone strikes, shrapnel wounds from ballistic missile fragments, traumatic brain injuries from the concussive force of nearby detonations. Most of these service members eventually returned to duty, which sounds like good news until you consider what returning to duty actually means in this specific context. going back to the exact same exposed position night after night, knowing the same kind of attack could happen again at any moment. Now let's talk about the base that supposedly got wiped out, because this is where rumor and reality genuinely intersect in a complicated way. Wafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan was struck hard on July 17th. Iran used some of its more advanced ballistic missiles in that attack, weapons specifically designed to be difficult for Patriot missile defense systems to intercept. 2 missiles reportedly hit the base directly. The strike killed the 3 soldiers already mentioned and sent several others to hospitals in Jordan. But wiped off the map is not an accurate description of what happened there. The base absorbed a serious, painful hit. It did not cease to exist. That distinction matters, because exaggerating destruction in either direction, understating it or wildly overstating it, makes it harder for anyone watching this conflict to actually understand what is happening and what comes next. Other bases across the region took hits during the same window too. Kuwait's Udari base had ammunition and storage structures destroyed in a retaliatory strike. A watchtower connected to American naval operations in Bahrain sustained damage. Earlier in this war, Saudi Arabia's Prince Sultan Air Base, shared by American and Saudi forces, was struck hard enough to wound more than a dozen service members and reportedly damage refueling aircraft on the ground. None of these were symbolic pinpricks. All of them represent a pattern that should genuinely concern anyone paying attention. American forward positions across an entire region absorbing real, repeated damage from an opponent that many assumed would fold within days. Step back and look at the map of everywhere this pattern has touched. Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. These are not scattered, disconnected countries. They form a chain of American forward positions stretching across the entire Gulf region, each one built up over decades, specifically because hosting American forces was supposed to provide security and stability in return. Watching that entire chain absorb repeated hits across a single sustained campaign tells you something important about how far this conflict has actually traveled from wherever anyone originally expected it to stay contained. That assumption, the idea that this would be short, sharp, and quickly decisive, is really where this entire story begins. And understanding why that assumption failed tells you almost everything you need to know about where this war stands right now. When this conflict launched back in February, the working theory inside Washington was straightforward. Strike hard, strike fast, and remove enough of Iran's leadership and military capability that the entire system would collapse under the pressure before it could organize a serious response. It is worth being honest about how that theory is actually held up against reality. Iran's government did not collapse. Its supreme leader was killed in the opening strikes, an enormous shock to the entire region, but a successor stepped into that role in the machinery of the state. Kept functioning. Iran continued launching missiles. It continued organizing retaliatory strikes across multiple countries. Now, whatever the original plan assumed about Iranian collapse, the actual 13 days of continuous strikes in July prove that assumption was wrong. Because a country on the verge of collapse does not sustain a coordinated multi-front retaliation campaign against the most powerful military on Earth for months on end. It is worth understanding exactly why that original assumption failed so badly, because the reasoning behind it tells you something important about how wars like this actually get planned. Decision makers tend to build strategy around the assumptions that feel most comfortable, rather than the ones most supported by evidence. A theory that predicts a quick, clean victory is simply more appealing to act on than a theory that predicts a long, grinding conflict with no clear endpoint. There is also a well-documented tendency to assume an opponent thinks and reacts the way you would in their position, when in reality, an adversary shaped by an entirely different history, culture, and set of survival instincts almost never responds the way outside planners expect. Iran spent decades operating under sanctions, isolation, and periodic military threats. A government with that much practical experience absorbing pressure does not collapse the same way a fragile, untested government might. Before we go any further into why that original strategy failed so badly, one quick favor. If breakdowns like this, correcting the noise and giving you what is actually verified, are useful to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this war is still active and this channel intends to keep tracking it, honestly, number by number. Let's talk about what Iran has actually been doing throughout this war, because understanding their strategy explains why 13 straight nights of American bombing did not produce the collapse many expected. Iran has spent years, not months, preparing for exactly this kind of conflict. Missile production dispersed across multiple facilities, weapons stored underground, away from easy targeting. A strategy built not around winning a symmetrical fight against a superior air force, but around surviving long enough and inflicting enough pain in return that the cost of continuing the war eventually outweighs whatever benefit the other side hoped to gain. Every report of degraded Iranian missile launch capacity gets met with continued Iranian strikes using precise, advanced weapons that still, find their targets. But that gap between claimed destruction and actual continued capability is one of the most important, least understood parts of this entire conflict. There is a specific military logic behind that gap worth explaining clearly. Every time a missile launcher gets destroyed, official reporting understandably counts that as a success, a piece of Iranian capability permanently removed from the equation. But that framing misses something crucial. If Iran built its entire strategy around dispersal, hiding capability across dozens or hundreds of locations, rather than concentrating it in a handful of obvious targets, then destroying any single facility barely dents the overall picture. It looks like progress on a briefing slide, showing strikes conducted and targets hit. It does not necessarily translate into meaningfully reduced capability on the ground, because the strategy was never built around protecting any single irreplaceable asset in the first place. The distinction between visible progress and actual strategic effect is exactly the kind of gap that produced false confidence early in this war. And it is exactly the kind of gap that 13 consecutive nights of continued Iranian retaliation should have corrected by now. There is also a harder truth buried inside this 13-day stretch, one that deserves serious attention rather than dismissal. A full-scale ground invasion of Iran, the kind of option some voices have floated publicly, is simply not realistic given the current size and structure of American ground forces. Decades ago, the United States could deploy hundreds of thousands of troops into this exact region for a sustained ground campaign. That capacity does not exist at the same scale today. Modern warfare has also changed dramatically, with drone surveillance and precision weapons, making any large-scale troop buildup extremely vulnerable, long before it could even establish a foothold. Anyone suggesting a straightforward ground option is either unaware of these realities or deliberately ignoring them. Consider the sheer scale of what an actual ground campaign against a country this size would require. Iran stretches roughly 1,000 miles from one end to the other, across terrain that ranges from mountainous border regions to vast interior stretches that would be extraordinarily difficult for any invading force to control, let alone hold for a sustained period. Decades ago, a buildup like the one that preceded the Gulf War took months of slow, visible troop and equipment movement into the region before a single major operation began. That kind of slow buildup is simply not survivable in today's environment, where persistent satellite surveillance and widespread drone coverage mean an adversary can watch every ship, every convoy, every staging area in near real time. Any attempt to repeat that old playbook would likely be detected and targeted long before it reached the scale needed to actually accomplish anything on the ground. So if a quick victory failed, and a ground invasion is not realistic, and a blockade strategy already collapsed, once earlier this year, what does that actually leave? It leaves exactly what we watched unfold over these 13 days. A grinding, painful campaign of strikes and counterstrikes with no clear off-ramp in sight for either side. That absence of an off-ramp deserves real attention because it is the single most important dynamic shaping everything happening right now. Ending a war like this requires both sides to conclude that continuing costs more than stopping. Right now, neither side appears to have reached that conclusion. American officials continue describing military progress in terms of strikes conducted and targets hit, numbers that sound impressive in a briefing room, but say very little about whether the underlying strategic goals are actually being achieved. Iranian officials, meanwhile, continue describing this war in terms of survival and resistance, framing every day they remain standing as evidence that the pressure campaign has failed. There is a specific reason that gap in framing matters so much for where this war goes next. A government that measures success by counting strikes conducted will eventually run out of new targets worth striking, at which point continuing the campaign produces diminishing returns without a corresponding shift in the underlying political outcome. A government that measures success simply by surviving another day does not face that same ceiling, because survival itself is the metric. And every day the government remains standing counts as a win by that definition, regardless of the damage absorbed along the way. When two sides are measuring success using completely different scales like that, finding a mutually acceptable point to actually stop fighting becomes extraordinarily difficult, because neither side is actually working toward the same definition of victory in the first place. Here's something worth sitting with honestly. The oil markets are already showing the strain of this stretched 13-day campaign and everything that has followed it. Commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has been repeatedly disrupted throughout this conflict. Reports during this period described mining activity near the strait, a threat that, even if only partially confirmed, sends its own message about how far Iran is willing to go to make continuing this war costly for everyone involved, not just the United States directly. Nations far from this conflict, countries that import the majority of their oil and gas through this exact waterway, have found themselves absorbing real economic pain from a war they have no direct part in. Think specifically about which countries are absorbing that pain most directly. Nations across Asia depend heavily on oil flowing through this exact corridor, far more heavily in percentage terms than the United States itself does. When that flow gets disrupted, even partially, even temporarily, the ripple effects reach economies and households thousands of miles from any battlefield. A factory in a country with no stake whatsoever in this conflict slows production because fuel costs have spiked. A family halfway around the world pays more for basic transportation because a shipping lane they have never heard of became unreliable. That is the quiet, often invisible signature of a war fought over control of a critical choke point. Consequences that spread far beyond anyone actually holding a weapon. We are now well past the halfway point of this breakdown. If you have made it this far, you clearly want accuracy over sensationalism, and that is exactly why this channel exists. So do me one favor. Share this specific video with somebody who is still repeating that inflated 455 figure, because correcting bad information matters just as much as reporting good information. Let's talk about the countries hosting American forces across this region, because their position has become genuinely uncomfortable as this war has dragged on. Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all of them have absorbed strikes, damage, or direct threats specifically because they host American military positions. That reality has produced a broader warning from Iranian officials during this period, stating plainly that any nation hosting bases involved in strikes against Iran should expect consequences of its own. That message lands very differently depending on which government you ask, but every single one of them is now facing the same uncomfortable calculation. The partnership with the United States, once viewed as a source of protection and stability, now comes attached to a rising cost that climbs with every new exchange in this war. There is a deeper question buried inside that calculation, one that stretches well beyond this specific conflict. What happens to the decades-old arrangement of American bases scattered across this region once this war eventually ends? Some of the sharpest analysis of this conflict has pointed toward a genuine structural shift. The idea that the entire post-war arrangement that shaped this region for the better part of a century may not survive this war intact. Countries that hosted American forces because it offered protection are now discovering that hosting those forces has instead made them direct targets. That realization does not simply disappear once the shooting eventually stops. It reshapes how every government across this region thinks about hosting foreign military power going forward. There is historical weight behind that shift too, worth understanding clearly. The current arrangement of borders, alliances, and foreign military presence across this region traces back roughly a century to agreements drawn up by outside powers with little regard for how the people actually living there wanted their own future shaped. That arrangement has already been fraying for years, strained by shifting alliances, changing energy markets, and a younger generation across the region increasingly skeptical of arrangements imposed from the outside. A war of this scale and duration, one that has directly damaged the very bases meant to provide security, does not simply pause that longer unraveling. It very likely accelerates it, forcing governments across the region to openly reconsider arrangements that many had quietly questioned for years, but rarely challenged out loud. Now let's talk about something that deserves far more attention than it has received, the nuclear dimension sitting quietly underneath this entire conflict. Iran's longtime supreme leader had reportedly maintained a religious ruling against developing nuclear weapons for decades. He's gone now, killed in the opening strikes of this war. His successor inherited leadership of a nation currently under sustained military attack from the most powerful military alliance on Earth, having personally lost family members in this same conflict. Think about the lesson that succession sends to every government watching. This war unfold from a distance. A country without nuclear weapons remains vulnerable to exactly this kind of sustained military pressure. A country with them becomes far harder to attack in this manner. That lesson does not stay contained to Iran alone. Every government currently weighing whether to pursue its own nuclear program is watching this specific war closely, drawing exactly that conclusion, whether anyone officially says so out loud or not. Think about how that lesson likely lands in capitals well beyond Tehran. Any government that has ever faced pressure, sanctions, or military threats from a much larger power is watching this exact sequence of events unfold in real time. A nation without a nuclear deterrent absorbed a sustained military campaign, lost its top leader, and continued fighting anyway, at enormous cost, because it had no other card left to play. That is not an abstract lesson confined to academic debate. It is a very concrete, very visible demonstration playing out on the news, and history shows that demonstrations like this one tend to accelerate exactly the kind of proliferation decisions that the original military campaign was supposedly designed to prevent in the first place. That is genuinely one of the most dangerous long-term consequences of this entire conflict, more dangerous in some ways than any single night of strikes. A war fought partly to prevent nuclear proliferation may end up accelerating it instead, not just inside Iran, but across an entire region of governments now recalculating what actually keeps them safe from this kind of sustained attack. Let's return to the human cost one more time, because it is easy to lose sight of real people inside a conversation this heavy with strategy and geopolitics. Behind every confirmed American death is a family that received the worst possible phone call. Behind every confirmed wounded service member is someone dealing with injuries, physical or otherwise, that will likely follow them for years after this war eventually ends. And behind every Iranian casualty figure, numbers that remain deeply contested between Iranian officials, independent monitoring groups, and American and Israeli estimates, are civilians and combatants alike who never had any say in how this war started or how long it continues. It is worth being honest about just how contested those broader casualty figures actually are. Iranian officials have put forward one set of numbers. Independent human rights monitoring organizations tracking this conflict have compiled their own separate estimates, often landing in a similar range to Iran's own figures. American and Israeli estimates place the total considerably higher. These numbers do not agree with each other, and they may never fully reconcile, because war zones make precise counting extraordinarily difficult. And every side involved has its own reasons to shape the numbers in whichever direction best serves its own narrative. But even the most conservative estimates describe thousands of confirmed deaths and tens of thousands of injuries across this entire conflict. A human cost that dwarfs the specific, smaller, but very real American losses that dominate headlines back home. It is worth sitting honestly with why that disparity exists, rather than simply reciting the numbers and moving on. Distance plays a role. A conflict thousands of miles away, involving people whose names and faces rarely appear in domestic coverage, simply does not generate the same emotional weight for viewers far removed from it, no matter how large the actual numbers grow. Familiarity plays a role too. American names, American hometowns, American uniforms carry an immediate personal resonance for an American audience that numbers from unfamiliar cities in a distant country simply cannot replicate, however tragic those numbers genuinely are. None of that makes the disparity in attention fair or accurate. It simply explains why it exists. And understanding that gap is part of what it actually means to follow a conflict like this one, honestly, rather than selectively. So where does this actually leave us, 13 days into this latest brutal stretch of continuous strikes, with no ceasefire currently holding and no clear resolution in sight? A few things are worth watching closely in the days ahead. Watch whether this pattern of continuous nightly strikes continues at the same intensity, or whether exhaustion on either side eventually forces another pause, the way it did back in June, even if that pause proves just as fragile as the last one did. Watch the casualty numbers on every side, because they tell a more honest story than official statements ever fully can. A rising wounded count, even without dramatic new death tolls, still reflects an active, grinding conflict rather than one genuinely winding toward resolution. Watch how neighboring governments across this region respond to the growing cost of hosting American forces, because that calculation is shifting in real time, and the decisions those governments make in the coming months will shape the security architecture of this entire region for decades. And watch whether the nuclear proliferation risk sitting quietly underneath this entire war starts becoming an open, explicit conversation among other governments, rather than the unspoken subtext it currently remains. That shift, if it happens, would represent one of the most consequential long-term outcomes of this entire conflict, far outlasting whatever headline dominates any single news cycle right now. There is one more thing worth watching closely, something that rarely gets the attention it deserves in daily coverage. Watch how quickly accurate information actually manages to catch up with exaggerated claims, like the one that opened this video. Every war generates its own fog of competing numbers, inflated casualty figures, unverified claims of decisive victories, rumors of secret negotiations that may or may not actually be happening behind closed doors. The speed at which accurate reporting manages to correct that fog, or fails to, shapes public understanding just as powerfully as anything happening on an actual battlefield. A public working from bad numbers makes worse decisions, supports worse policies, and holds decision makers accountable to the wrong standard entirely. Getting the numbers right is not a minor technical detail sitting outside the real story. It is part of the real story. Whatever comes next, here is what is already true and unlikely to change. The inflated numbers circulating online, 455 American dead, a base wiped off the map, is not what actually happened. What actually happened is still serious enough to deserve your full attention without a single exaggerated digit attached to it. 13 consecutive nights of strikes. Real American deaths, each one a name and a hometown rather than a statistic. Real damage to real bases across an entire region. A war with no clear off-ramp, no obvious victory in sight for either side, and consequences that are already reshaping how an entire region thinks about security, alliances, and survival. That is the real story. Not the version that spreads fastest online, but the version that actually holds up when you check it against what has been confirmed. And understanding the real version matters more now than it ever has, because this war is not close to over, and every exaggerated number that spreads unchecked makes it just a little bit harder for anyone watching from the outside to actually understand what is happening and why it matters. Years from now, when people look back at how this war was actually covered while it was happening, the exaggerated numbers and the accurate ones will both be part of that record. The version that gets remembered as true will not be decided by which one spread fastest in the moment. It will be decided by which one actually held up over time, against every correction, every follow-up report, every reconciled figure released long after the initial headline faded. That is the version worth building your understanding around now, rather than waiting years to sort it out later. If this breakdown gave you the accurate picture instead of the viral one, that is exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment telling me what other numbers from this war you have seen floating around that deserve a closer, honest look, because there are plenty more out there worth checking. And share this specifically with someone who needs the real figures instead of the frightening but false ones currently spreading across their feed. Say the real names: Isabella Gonzalez, Tyler Feehan, Angel Rampersad. Remember the real number of consecutive nights this specific stretch actually lasted: 13. Not exaggerated, not diminished, just accurate. And remember that understanding a war like this one is never about which number sounds more shocking. It is about which number is actually true, and having the patience to find that number, even when a louder, scarier one is spreading faster across every feed you scroll through today. 13 days. Real names. Real verified numbers. However uncomfortable and difficult they already are, without a single extra digit added for dramatic effect. That is the story worth carrying forward from here, long after the louder, false version has already faded from whatever feed first brought it to you.